left in the desert with a slit throat. A Lakota chief found her and gave her her voice back. The buzzards told me. I know how that sounds, but that is how it was. 3 of them turning slow circles over the wash, and I had been watching the sky the way a man watches it when there is nothing else moving in the world, and those birds were wrong. Too low. Circling before the thing was finished. That is a different kind of patience than the kind they use on the dead. I have seen both, and something in me said to ride toward it rather than away. Her name was Nora Cal. I did not know that for 11 days. She was lying half in the dry creek bed where the wash bends east, and she had one hand still hooked into the roots of a desert willow like she had grabbed it when she fell, or when she was thrown, and had not let go. I came off my horse and walked down to her, and when I turned her over she looked at me with eyes that had death in them but also something else. Anger, maybe. A refusal. The blood on her neck had gone brown, and her lips were cracked to the gum line, and there was a cut across her throat that someone had meant to finish her with and had not. Whoever did it was either a poor hand with a blade or had been interrupted. Either way she was alive and the buzzards had been wrong. I put water on her lips, she drank, then she slept. I had been alone in that country for 6 years at that point. My wife, Winona, had died of fever in the spring of '79, the same spring that most of what I had known came apart. My sons were grown and gone into the North Country. The world I had been part of, the old agreements, the old territories, the old understandings, none of it held any more. I had a camp and a horse and the tools of a man who means to stay someplace, and I had stopped expecting much from the days. That is not grief exactly. It is more like the feeling after grief has finished with you, a flatness where the hills used to be. I lifted her onto my horse and walked the 7 miles back to camp. She had no fever that first night, which surprised me. The wound was deep but had not gone into anything it could not come back from. I had seen knife wounds enough to know. I cleaned it with the yarrow water my wife had always used. I had kept the habit, not because I expected to need it, but because some habits are the only thing that keep a man from going entirely hollow. And I wrapped her throat in the softest cloth I had, which was what remained of one of Winona's blouses I had kept folded in the bottom of a cedar chest. I do not know why I used that particular cloth. I did not think about it until after. For 3 days she ran no fever and took no water, and seemed to be deciding whether to stay. On the 4th day she opened her eyes and looked at me with sense behind them. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not silence. I mean the effort was there, her throat worked, her face changed, but no sound followed. She tried twice and then closed her mouth and looked at the ceiling of the shelter, and something crossed her face that was the worst kind of fear I have ever seen on a person. The kind that arrives when you understand what has been taken from you. I reached over and put my hand over hers where it lay on the blanket. I said, "You are safe here." She turned her head and looked at me for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. I did not know if she believed me. I thought probably she did not. A woman found in the desert with her throat cut has got some evidence on the other side of the question. Her voice came back in pieces over days, the way things come back after cold, first a whisper, then something with weight to it, then once on the 9th morning a sound like a word but too rough to make out. She had started writing on the slate I kept for tallying horses. She would write something and hold the slate toward me and I would read it and nod. The first thing she wrote was, "Did you see who did it?" I shook my head. The second thing was, "The men who did this will look for me." I read that and I put the slate down and I looked at her and I said, "Let them look." I am not sure what she made of that. I am not sure what I made of it myself, saying it out loud. But it was true. Her name, when she could make it known to me, was Nora. She wrote the Cal part first, and then pointed at herself and wrote Nora after. And I understood she came from some family in the territory, because she wrote Cal with the straightness people give to names they expect to be recognized. I did not recognize it. I told her so. She looked at me with something that might have been amusement, which was the first time her face had done that. The story came out slowly over the next several weeks. Not in a flood. She was not a woman who spoke in floods even when she had her voice back. But in pieces, the way it happens when you are still deciding how much of a thing is yours to tell and how much belongs to the ground you'd rather cover over. Her husband had been a rancher. He had borrowed money from a man named Harlan Grubb who had come out of Missouri with a lawyer's tongue and a banker's patience, and no particular conscience that Nora had ever been able to detect. When her husband died, she said this flat and quick, like a woman who has already been through the grief and come out the other side. Grubb had arrived at the ranch with 3 men and a piece of paper. She had told him the paper was fraudulent. She had been right. And being right, she had made an enemy of a man who preferred things uncomplicated. She had been left in the desert to die so that the question of what was hers could be settled, without a voice in the room. That last part she wrote on the slate, and she underlined the last 4 words, and she looked at me when I finished reading it with something hard and clear in her eyes. She said, and it was the most I had heard from her at once because her voice was still finding itself, "I have land and a deed and he has neither, but a dead woman cannot testify." I said, "Then we will make sure you are not dead." She looked at me a while after that. I cannot tell you what she was measuring. I only know that after a moment she nodded once, a slow thing like a decision. That was that for a time. She healed. I watched. I want to be plain about what I mean by that watched, not the watching of a man with designs. The watching of a man who has been responsible for something living and is taking that responsibility at its true weight. She was mine to protect. That was the fact of it. Everything else was later. She began helping around the camp when she had the strength. She was efficient with her hands, not elegant but practical, the way people are when they have always worked and never thought much about whether working was a thing they wanted to do. She rebuilt the cook fire one morning in a way I had not seen before, with the stones arranged so the wind ran through rather than around and the fire burned hotter with less wood. I watched her do it. I did not say anything, but I thought, this is a woman who knows things. There was a morning, it must have been the 3rd week, maybe the 4th, when I came back to camp from checking the horses and found her sitting outside with the rifle I kept leaning by the door in her lap, working a piece of waxed cloth along the barrel. She looked up at me without apology. She said, "The spring needed work, I've fixed it." I took the rifle from her and worked the action, and she was right. She had fixed it. I had not asked her to. She had simply seen a thing that needed doing and done it. I said, "You know guns." She said, "My father had 4 daughters and no sons. He taught all of us." I put the rifle back and sat down across from her. I said, "The man who did this to you, you know where to find him." She said, "Briggs Junction. He runs the bank and 3 of the 7 men on the town council. He has the sheriff in his pocket and 2 of the deputies." I said, "How many men does he carry?" She counted on her fingers, looking at the sky. 6, she said. "Maybe more, depending on what he's arranged since I've been gone." I thought about that. Then I said, "Tell me about the deed." She looked at me, then she told me. The land was 300 acres of good grass on the north end of a valley that Grubb wanted, because it sat between his holdings and the river, and without it, his cattle had to come the long way around. He had arranged the loan after her husband's death in a manner that looked proper if you only looked quickly, and the paper he had presented her with had a signature that was almost right but not quite. She had seen her husband's signature 10,000 times. She knew. I asked her where the deed was now. She had hidden it, before they took her, in a place no one would find it who did not know what they were looking for. I asked her if she could get to it. She said, "Not alone." Not alone. That was the shape of the thing between us, I think, right from the start. She had never asked me for anything that she was not also offering something in return. She did not ask for protection as though it were something owed her. She asked for it the way one person asks another who has what they need, plainly, with her own cards on the table. A fair trade. She would tell me where the deed was if I would ride with her to get it. What happened after was what happened after. She did not try to make it simple. I have been around people all my life who assume that what they need from you is simply theirs to take. It is remarkable, after all those years, to be asked. I said yes. I said we would ride in 3 days when her strength was fuller. She nodded. Then she said, I don't know your name. I have been calling you something in my head, but I am fairly sure I've got it wrong. I told her my name. She said it back. She said it carefully, making sure she had the shape of it right. Then she said, I won't forget it. I believed her. We left at first light 3 days later. She was on Winona's mare, which was a good horse, steady in rough country, and she sat it well. I had my rifle and my pistol and the short-handled axe I had carried for 20 years, which is not a weapon but also is, depending on the need. The country between my camp and Briggs Junction was 30 miles of scrub and rock and 2 river crossings, and we rode most of the first day without talking, which was comfortable. She was not a woman who needed sound to fill silence. I respected that. We camped at the first river crossing. I made a fire and she set about making a meal from what we had carried, and she worked the way she always worked, without display, without commentary. She handed me a tin plate and I ate, and the food was better than what I cooked for myself, which I told her. She said she'd had a lot of practice. After we ate, she looked at the fire a while, and then she said, I have been thinking about whether you understand what you've agreed to. I said, I understand Grubb and his men will try to kill me. She said, among other things, Briggs Junction is not, she paused, choosing. She said, there are people there who will not receive you well. I said, I have been received worse. She looked at me. She said, I believe you. That is not what concerns me. I don't want what's mine to cost you something it shouldn't. I looked at the fire. I said, I have been in that country before, every version of it. They will do what they do, and then I will still be standing and we will have your deed. That is how I see it. She was quiet. Then she said, soft, how do you manage to be so certain? I said, I have been uncertain about a great many things. I got to a point where I decided to be certain about the things I could, what I am capable of, what is right. The rest I don't bother about. She was quiet again for longer. Then she said, my husband was not a certain man. He was good. He was kind. But he was not certain about anything, and in the end the uncertain ones get moved off their land. I said nothing. There are things that don't need answering. After a while she said, I am glad you were watching the sky that day. I said, so am I. That was all. She rolled into her blanket and I sat by the fire until it was low, and then I lay down with my rifle and watched the stars, which out in that country are an overwhelming thing when the moon is down, just an impossible number of them burning over the black ridgeline. And I thought about what she had said, glad you were watching the sky. And I thought about the 6 years since Winona, the flatness I had described to myself as peace. And I understood for the first time that I had been waiting for something to require me again, not looking for it, not hoping, just open to it, in the way a man who has put down arms is still a man with arms. Briggs Junction was a 2-street town with the bank on the corner and the sheriff's office across the road from it, and it smelled of horse and sawdust, and somewhere a tannery working. We came in on a Thursday because Nora said Thursday was when Grubb left for his Eastern holdings and would not return until Sunday, and she was right. The bank was manned by a thin young man with a paper collar who went white when Nora walked in. She had told me about him on the ride. He was not one of Grubb's. He was an ordinary frightened young man who did not like what he had been part of. She had read that in him correctly. We stood on either side of the counter and Nora looked at him and said, I'm alive, as you can see. I need the secure box. He swallowed twice. He said, Mr. Grubb said. Nora said, I don't work for Mr. Grubb. Neither, I think, do you. If you can avoid it, can you avoid it? He looked at me. I did not say anything. I did not need to. He brought the box. Inside it was the deed. Nora unfolded it and looked at it for a moment the way you look at something after you've spent a long time not knowing if it still exists. Then she folded it and put it inside her coat. We were back on the street in 11 minutes. She said as we mounted, "That was the easy part." I said, "I know." Grubb's men came before we reached the edge of town. 2 of them from a side street and 1 from the doorway of a dry goods store and 1 stepping out of the alley behind the livery. 4, not 6, and no Grubb. The leader was a big man with a bad tooth showing on the left side, and a rifle he was being deliberate about not pointing yet, which is the kind of deliberate that means he has not decided. He looked at me, he said, "This is none of your business, Chief." I said, "And yet here I am." He looked at Nora, he said, "You're supposed to be dead." She said, "You can see the trouble with that arrangement." He looked at his men. Then he looked back at me and I watched him calculate what I was capable of, whether there was a version of this that ended clean. I have had that calculation made about me many times. I know what it looks like from the outside. I kept my face still and let him count. He said, "She's carrying property that belongs to Mr. Grubb." I said, "She is carrying property that belongs to her." I watched the deed drawn up. I watched her husband's signature. I will testify to it in any court in this territory. That last part was not true, but the saying of it out loud in a public street with 3 townspeople now watching from the boardwalk was what mattered. He knew it. A living woman and a witness and a deed is a different problem from a dead woman and silence. He stood there another moment, then he lowered the rifle. He said, "Grubb won't forget this." I said, "Good, tell him exactly how it happened." We rode out of Briggs Junction and did not hurry, which was the important part. Hurrying would have told them something. We rode at a walk all the way to the bend in the road, and then we rode at a walk a while longer, and I watched behind us because that is what you do, and nothing came. And after another mile Nora let out a long, slow breath I think she had been holding for half an hour. She said without looking at me, "You lied." I said I did. She said, "You would have testified." I said, "If it had come to that." She wrote a little while. She said, "I believe you." We were back at my camp by late afternoon on the second day. She did not say anything about leaving. I did not say anything about it either. She unsaddled the mare and brushed her out and hung the tack on the peg I had built for Winona's saddle. And the sight of that, the ordinary practicality of it, her hands moving on the familiar leather, landed somewhere in my chest in a way I had not expected. That evening she cooked again, and we ate outside because the night was mild, and at some point she leaned over and refilled my cup from the pot without being asked, the way a person does when they are at home in a place and not thinking about whether they have the right to be, and I sat with that feeling for a long time. Later, much later, when the fire was low, she said, "I don't know where I would go." I said, "You don't have to go anywhere." She looked at me. She said, "You've been alone a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to be?" I looked at the coals. I said, "I have not wanted very much lately. I think that was a kind of damage I was doing myself without knowing it." She was quiet. Then she said, "I know that feeling." She got up and came and sat beside me close, and after a moment she put her hand on my forearm where it rested on my knee, and her hand was warm from the fire and she did not take it away. I looked at it there on my arm. I thought about Winona, and I thought that Winona had been a woman who understood that life was for the living, and that the living owed it to each other not to refuse what was being offered plainly. I put my hand over Nora's. She said, "That night I was in the wash. I thought I was finished, and then I thought I am not ready. I am not done. I just kept thinking it. I am not done." I said, "You weren't." She turned her head and looked at me close, and her eyes were steady in the firelight, a dark hazel, and she said, "You gave me that. You riding out and finding me. You giving me time to come back. You standing in that street." I said, "You would have found a way." She said, "Maybe, but not this way, not with someone beside me." I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say anything. which I think was the right answer because she leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat like that until the fire was out and the stars were the only light, and I was aware of myself in a way I had not been in years, aware of being a man with a woman beside him who had chosen to be there, not because she had to, not because she was grateful, but because she had looked at me and found something worth staying for. I am not a man who has needed a great deal of praise. But that, a woman with her own strength and her own clear eyes looking at me and deciding, that is a different thing from praise. That is someone seeing what is actually there and saying yes. That is the thing a man can go years without and not even know he is missing it because he has learned to live so quiet. In the morning she was still there. She made coffee. She handed me mine the same way she had the night before, without ceremony, without making anything of it, and I took it from her hand and we stood outside and looked at the country in the early light, the flats going gold and the far ridge still in blue shadow, and she said, "I'll need to deal with Grubb properly. A lawyer and the county court and a letter to the land office." I said, "I know a judge in Cheyenne who does not owe Grubb anything." She looked at me, she said, "Of course you do." I said, "He owes me a favor, in fact." She shook her head, something almost like a laugh behind it, and drank her coffee. She said, "I will need to go to the ranch, to put it back in order. There is fencing down and I have not been there in," she paused, counting, 6 weeks at least. I said, "I'll ride with you." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "The whole country is going to talk." I said, "The whole country has talked about me before. I have survived it." She said, "They'll say things about me too." I said, "Will that stop you?" She thought about that, genuinely thought, the way she did everything without hurry, with her whole attention. Then she said, "No." I said, "Then it is settled." She turned back to the view and we stood there drinking our coffee, and the light kept coming up over the ridge, and the flats turned from gold to the ordinary dusty color of the day, and I thought about what she had asked me the night before, "Do you want to be alone?" And I thought, no. No, I have not wanted it. I have only been good at it. There is a difference, and I am glad I know it now. Her voice is back all the way, fully back. Sometimes at the end of the day when we are sitting outside and she is reading or working on something, she says my name, not for any reason, not because she needs something, just says it, the way you say the name of a thing you are glad is there. I hear it every time like it is the first time. That is her gift. I did not ask for it. I did not expect it. But she gives it freely every day, and I have learned to take it the way you take water after a long dry, without embarrassment, without making a speech about it. Just take it. Let it in. Let it matter. The deed is on record at the county seat. Grubb's men came to the ranch twice in the first month. Both times they found me there, and both times they left without incident, which is a way of saying both times they looked at what was in front of them and made a decision. I do not know that they will not come again. I know that when they do, I will still be here. That is the part I did not have before. The part where what I can do and what I am willing to do and who I am doing it for are all the same answer. The part where the valley knows it and Nora knows it and I know it, and that is enough. Nora's voice when she says my name is low and sure. I never get tired of hearing it.